Yeah, so we're marking nearly the 1 year anniversary of our meetup. It was actually last summer that we all started. We were starting a small little coffee shop, just a couple people coming together, and we've come all this way. We've got now over 400 members, and we're doing the webinar series with a lot of people coming and a lot of engagement. And this is actually our 4th webinar series and our 15th official meetup with the Vancouver Psychedelics meetup. So, you know, it's all about the community that comes together, not even the actual space where it takes place. So it's you guys that make this what it is. So thank you for being here. With that being said, we've got a very exciting topic lined up for today. This is actually the most requested topic that we've had. I've had countless people messaging me about this and asking us to do this on the topic of microdosing, because it's something that's become so pervasive in our culture and something that's very predominant even in the media. And a lot of people like the idea of not necessarily having to take that big leap of faith when instead of taking a big dose of psychedelics, you can take a small sub-perceptual dose with a lot of touted, benefits like decreased anxiety, mood enhancement, creativity, and so forth. So that's something we'll be getting into with the best of our 2 guests we've got who are going to be giving the talk. It's going to be Evan and Anna, and I'll introduce them briefly in just a minute. I'm just going to give you guys a layout of what our structure is going to look like. So they'll do their talk, which is about a 30 to 40 minute range. And then after that, we're going to have about a half hour for questions and answers. So this is where you can actually ask your questions and really dive in deep and sort of pick their brains and get those answers there. Just so everyone knows, after this, we're going to have the breakout session. So these are something that's really been iconic with our meetups is a chance for everyone to come together in smaller groups of 6 to 8 and actually have a more intimate setting where you can discuss the topic and discuss things related to psychedelics. So I really encourage you guys to stay all the way to the end. We're also going to include a little intermission period where you can have a couple minutes to take a bathroom break and just get some food. That's kind of our layout. So just so everyone knows, up until the end of the Q&A, it is going to be recorded. This is so that we can distribute it to some members that are out here, as well as a YouTube channel coming forward. For issues with privacy, you can for those of you who want, keep your camera off. And there's options for typing in your questions and all that. So with that, I'm actually going to pass it on to Ken. Ken's going to be moderating and helping sort of make all this happen today. Ken's come on board to be helping us with this in an official capacity, both now in our webinar series, as well as in the physical settings going forward once that becomes a thing. So Ken, if you want to just take a couple minutes just to go through the ground rules and sort of how it works, how people can ask their questions and everything, and then I'll introduce Evan and Anna. I want to introduce Evan and Anna. So Evan is, both members are longtime members of the meetup, and Evan is a highly knowledgeable in the topic of psychedelics and is a psychonaut with a lot of experience and a lot of time researching and looking into the research and the scientific basis for microdosing and psychedelics. And he has a particular interest in the therapeutic applications of psychedelics for treatment-resistant psychiatric conditions. So Evan's got a lot of knowledge on that side. And also we have Anna. She is a microdosing enthusiast. She has a background in psychology and education, and she runs a education platform for microdosing. So with that, I give you Evan and Anna. Thank you guys for bringing this talk to us.
I guess I'm just going to start off with sharing my screen here. So I'm just going to disappear. Welcome, everyone. And I'm just going to present the promise of microdosing and my experience. And then Evan will take over and we'll talk about the unknown of this trend. So first and foremost, I do want to give you an overview of the talk and all the points I want to touch on. I'll be talking about the definition of microdosing and what it means in a general sense, and then in a psychedelic, community, then a bit of history and how it all started, some of the perceived benefits, what was my journey and how I started microdosing, the protocols, doses, type of psychedelics that people use to microdose with, tips on how to prepare your doses, preparation prior to microdosing that's kind of needed, and then how to set yourself up for success while microdosing. All right. But I guess first and foremost, I do want to start with one of my favorite quotes, and it's the best way to know yourself to be yourself is to know yourself. And I feel like it's quite fitting because I know myself, I'm, you know, covered in masks and conditioning and all that. And I feel like most of us are. And in order to let our true light shine through, we have to kind of find what our essence is. So psychedelics do just that. They're not a numbing technique. They will definitely bring to the surface things that we've been trying to hide or about ourselves. So while microdosing or macrodosing, you'll always find that things will come up for you. All right, so the definition. In the general sense, it's a technique used in the pharmacological field to test a new drug. So it's defined as a technique for studying the behavior of drugs in humans through the administration of doses so low, they're unlikely to produce whole body effects. But they're high enough to allow the cellular response to be studied. Now, this is called a phase 0 study, and it's usually conducted before a clinical phase 1. And it's done so to predict whether a drug is viable for the next phase of testing or not. Now, within the psychedelic community, the definition has been a bit changed, and it refers to the practice of using subperceptual doses of psychedelics in an attempt to improve creativity, to boost physical energy level, to achieve emotional balance, or you know, increase performance on problem solving, or treat anxiety, depression, or addiction. Now, how did it all start? Well, it kind of all started in early 2000s, 2009, 2010 probably, and it was glorified in the Silicon Valley within the tech industry. James Fadiman, a very famous psychologist, wrote this book, this guide called the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, and he laid out a way of taking these small doses of psychedelics for people to increase their performance. And obviously there was a huge appeal among the tech people to use this drug that would offer them uninterrupted focus and concentration and increase their performance. So that's why they all started doing it, and it kind of took off there. Now, also Steve Jobs was a huge advocate of using LSD to increase his creativity, and everyone wanted to emulate his genius. All right, some of the perceived benefits are, you know, improved focus, connection to your feelings. They do, psychedelics in general, they do make you more connected to your own feelings, other people's feelings, and you get to see how to be more empathic, or you know how to be more empathic in social situations, reduce anxiety, improved mood, reduce depression, increases creativity, enhanced verbal expression, and neurogenesis. This last part, neurogenesis, comes from Paul Stamets, which is another authority in the space, talking about the benefits of various mushrooms, including psychedelic mushrooms, to create new connections in your brain. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later when I will touch on the protocols of taking psychedelics in a microdosing setting. Okay, so now I'm just going to explain and talk a bit about my experience. So my experience with macrodosing psychedelics started probably 3 years ago, but the microdosing experience started probably 9 months ago. So I was very excited about this new thing, and I read a lot on the internet, but I wasn't quite sure what I was looking for. So even though I thought, you know, I read quite a lot and I was knowledgeable, Turns out later I found out that I wasn't informed about the details that actually mattered for me. So I started talking to people. I didn't know how to get, mushrooms nor LSD. So I started talking to people about psychedelics and microdosing, and it turned out at a house party that this girl worked for a company that was selling microdosing kits. And I got very excited and I ordered my first one. And I talked to them on the phone. They told me, how to take it. They recommended Paul Stamets' protocol. It was 4 days on, 3 days off. And the break was because it builds tolerance in your brain and you want to go back to normal. So that's why you take the break. And they told me it's 100 milligrams of grind mushrooms in there. So I took it, and I think one of the first mistakes I did was taking it at work. My work is in general quite laid back, and I normally focus on my tasks, but that particular day was quite intense, I would say. And the fact that I was microdosing, it didn't help. So there were all these emotions coming up and I didn't really know how to deal with. And then later I also found out that the dose was too much, because throughout the whole day I felt very tired. I felt famished. I was emotional. I was hungry and thirsty, and my eyes were red as if I smoked a bunch of cannabis, and I couldn't understand why I'm feeling like that. So at the end of the day, I realized that I hated microdosing. That was the biggest mistake. And, why did I even try to do that, basically? That was my conclusion. But I'm not one that, gives up easily. So I'm like, okay, well, I need to find out more about all these benefits that people are talking about, because it can be like everyone is experiencing amazing things with microdosing and I'm not. Like there must be something wrong here. So what I did, I actually went on Reddit. There is a subreddit dedicated to microdosing, and I just started reading through people's experiences. And it turns out that the dose I was taking was way too high. And it's funny because when you macrodose, you never really get those, those symptoms. But when you microdose and the microdose is too high, you just feel all of a sudden like crap. So I adjusted my dose, and I will talk about that a bit later. I adjusted my dose, and after a few trial and error sessions, I found the dose that actually works for me. And I was microdosing with mushrooms, and I found that when I microdose on mushrooms, I'm a lot more outgoing. I'm willing to talk to people more. I'm more excited to share my ideas, to hear their ideas. And just in general, it makes me a lot more social. Then I became a bit curious about what would be the difference microdosing with LSD. So I switched to LSD, and again, I went to the trial and error process of finding my dose. But when I found my dose, I also found that LSD, so they both put me in this flow mode where I could, work on a task and get creative and be very immersed in what I was doing. However, I felt like LSD was giving me a different sort of energy. It was such it was almost like my whole body was charged in a different way, and it made me laser focused on what I was doing, and it made me also less social. So that kind of overruled for me the idea that it was all a placebo. All right, so now let's talk about the intake protocols. So there are two most famous protocols that have been suggested by James Fadiman and Paul Stamets. And the first one is basically the performance enhanced protocol. it just says that if you microdose every 4th day, then you get to increase your creativity, you get all this boost of energy. So it's very much enhancing your life and enhancing your whole performance and your mood and how you interact with the world and with others. Now, the other theory, Paul Stamets is saying that if you take microdoses 4 days in a row and then take a break, then within those 4 days, you allow your brain to create new connections and stick together. So you know that neurons that fire together, wire together. That's basically what he's saying, that you can heal or reduce deep effects of brain trauma by taking microdoses. And he's also suggesting other type of substances to be added to those that would definitely create this neurogenesis. And so the famous Stamets stack was born, that includes psilocybin mushrooms, lion's mane, and niacin. So now I'm just gonna show you how those two protocols look like. So Fatima's protocol looks in this way, where you take it the first day, you take 2 days break, and then take it the 4th day. The 2nd day after microdosing is always the day when you will feel an afterglow. And the reason he suggests another day off microdosing is because you would get back to normal in his theory, and then you start again. Now, Stamets, on the other hand, he's suggesting the 4 days in a row and then the 3 days break, just because you want to get back again to normal and not have that tolerance belt. Now, some of the other protocols that I've encountered on the internet and I've tried myself was the 1 day on, 1 day off. And basically that's the one that I've started because I felt like it would suit my lifestyle better, and I really liked it. When I switched to Stamets protocol just to see how it felt, it made me a bit more tired than usual. So I'm not sure if what was happening, but yeah, I didn't really like taking microdoses days in a row. So I stuck to the last one, and then now I'm just doing Fatima's protocol, which is even more rare than I used to. All right, so let's talk about dose and how to determine your dosage. Now, you have to remember that it's always sub-perceptual. If you're tripping, you're not microdosing. That's basically the base rule. The way you do it, so the recommended start, it's always the 10th of a regular dose. For mushrooms, that would be 100 milligrams from, which is the 10th of a gram, or for LSD would be 10 micrograms, which is the 10th of 100 micrograms. Now you can start with that and make notes on how you feel. And if you don't feel anything, you can increase it. And as I said, you can increase by 25 milligrams of psilocybin mushrooms, increments of 25 milligrams for psilocybin mushrooms, or increments of 5 micrograms for LSD. Or if you feel too much, you can decrease it. So that's what I did. I started with 100 milligrams of mushrooms, and I realized that it was too much. So I decreased it to 75 milligrams, and that was still too much. And then I decreased it a bit more. And now my dose is at 50 milligrams. Now you always have to observe and adjust, and that's going to be the practice. And when you start microdosing, you want to microdose twice a week, only, with enough break in between to kind of reset to normal. So when you take the new microdose, you'll have observations and you'll know whether that that can be your dose or not. As I mentioned before, there are a few signs that your microdose is too high. So I felt all of those that I've listed here. Obviously, I like the fact that the colors were brighter, but everything else was a nightmare. I had a mild headache, especially in the back of my head, the red and dry eyes, and I was constantly famished. I've never had so much food in my life in one day. Just that was the first day of microdose. All right, so these are some of the other psychedelics people use to microdose. I don't personally have experience with any of those, but if there is plenty of data, I mean, there's plenty of anecdotal data on the internet if you wanna read more. All right, so tips on how to prepare your microdose. Now, I will just tell you some of the basic rules that you would have to follow in order to do it right, because the details matter. For microdosing mushrooms, you would want to have a grinder. You would want to have a very fine scale, 3 digits preferably, and then capsules if you don't like their taste. The reason why I'm suggesting a grinder is because as you might know, the stalks and the caps have different amounts of psilocybin in them. And if you microdose, even those, say for example, you microdose one day taking 50 milligrams of the cap, of the mushroom cap, and then the next day you will take 50 milligrams of the stalk mushroom, then you will have different sensations because it has different amount of psilocybin. So you want to homogenize that content of psilocybin. So you grind them, you weigh them, and then you take them. Now that's for mushrooms. If you want to microdose with LSD, normally you would like to have a 100 milligram of distilled water in a bottle. You would put your tab in there, leave it for 24 hours for the LSD to dissolve, and then with a syringe you would intake the amount of LSD you want. And the idea is the same. You homogenize the LSD in the distilled water. And the reason you do that is because, first of all, when you cut the tabs, you might not cut them in perfectly equal sizes. That's one thing. And then LSD tabs have hot spots. So you never really know where the droplet of LSD was placed on the tab. And you don't want that. All right, so there is a bit of preparation you need to do before starting microdosing. And I think the most important part is really get clear on the intention you are microdosing for. My intention was always to experiment. I'm very curious by nature, and I want to test limits, and I want to see what comes up. So I never really had any expectations. I just had the curiosity. So that was my intention for the microdosing, and I was open to anything that could happen. Obviously, you have to decide on the start date and the intake protocol, and you can adjust the intake protocol based on how you feel, and you can also end it whenever you want. You don't have to continue if it doesn't feel good. You always take it in the morning just because psychedelics are so energizing, and it might disrupt your sleep pattern. And I like this because, with psychedelics, you never know what can happen, but you have to have an open mind for nothing to happen or for everything to happen. And keep a journal, and journal every day, just because you don't want to base your experience on memories. Just like with memories, we can never really be sure about them. So you want to have an accurate you know, recording of your experience. And this is my daily journaling sheet. So I basically write down in the first frame whether it's a day on or off, what's the date, the time. If it's a day on, that then what substance am I microdosing with, what's the dosage, and the intention. Now you can see in the table that I'm rating from 0 to 10 various areas. So I pay attention to my mood, my energy, creativity, emotional awareness, body sensation, verbal expression, my social interactions, or the cognitive performance, whether I'm more focused, or I remember more things, or I forget more things, or what the case might be. And then on the horizontal line, that represents the timeline of the day. And once you filled in the table with the numbers and how, for example, the mood changes or fluctuates throughout the day, at the end of the day, you'll have a very succinct idea of how your microdosing day went. And then obviously you have on another page a notes page where you can actually write down the time and what happened and how it felt, and you can explain it a bit more. But I do like the overview, this overview page, because I can just glance at it and get an idea of how it felt looking back. All right, so setting yourself up for success. I feel like microdosing is a very, very useful practice when you want to adopt new habits. And to set yourself up for success, you want to adopt healthier habits in a sense. As I mentioned, psychedelics do give you a boost of energy, whether it's mental or physical, and you want to release that in a way. So taking a walk or doing, any sort of exercise would definitely help balance you. Now, the first thing I do in the morning when I microdose is I lie down on the ground and I check in with myself, and I kind of see where I'm at with my feelings. And I find this, I call it a grounding technique, because it always helps me calm my anxiety. And when I microdose, sometimes things happen and I need something to go back to help me ground myself. And this practice, I find it's very useful to me. And I started doing that when I started microdosing, and now I'm doing it even, I'm not microdosing as often, so, which is nice. It helps all the other habits stick, I find. Another thing that I've noticed is that if I eat cleaner food, the microdosing days feel a lot better. But I guess that goes with anything else, right? In life, eating healthier will definitely make you feel better. So I'm not sure if it's due to microdosing, but that's basically what I found, is that when I started microdosing, I was motivated to include some of these new healthier habits into my life, and they stuck even though I wasn't microdosing the days when I was microdosing. And another thing that I've heard, Paul Austin, the author of The Third Wave, is one of the people I look up to and for guidance for microdosing. And he was saying something very interesting that I might use later. He said that once you notice how you feel when you microdose, so say for example you find that you are more social microdosing mushrooms, you can use microdosing mushrooms for that particular setting. So for example, if you have a dinner party you want to go to, or a networking event, or anything that's social, knowing that microdosing on mushrooms would make you feel more social, you can microdose on that day for that particular reason. And I find that, you know, that's a very healthy way of looking at it. All right, thank you. And I will give the floor to Evan now to talk about the unknown about microdosing. So I will stop broadcasting.
Hey, Anna. I'm going to ask you a quick question, actually, before Evan takes over. There were a bunch of questions that I think were very specific to your portion. So would you mind taking some of those now, or do you want to wait to the end?
I can do it either or. I don't want to disrupt the flow of the meeting. So it doesn't.
That's fine by me if you want to do that. I think it looks like we have a few questions, so you might as well do it now.
Okay, okay. Yeah, let's do that.
Cool. So I know there was one, Kate and Adam had asked, Kate had said, do you rate every hour? And then Adam had asked, do you rate as frequently on off days as you do on days?
At the beginning, I was very diligent and I was rating every hour, but then I got tired because, you know, it's a lot of work. And throughout the day, I did find that some things happen and I would feel in a certain way. So I would definitely write those down and I would rate that particular time and then also input the notes. And yes, I do rate also the off days.
As often, or maybe less often, or the same?
Well, as I said at the beginning, it was more often than right now. Yeah. But yes, I try to do it in a way equal, so I could compare it.
Cool, makes sense. Heather had another one. Remember, if anyone wants to ask a question over audio, you can hit the raise hand button. Heather had asked, do you suggest taking the microdose quickly or adding it to a beverage that might take hours to drink? Does it matter either way?
I suggest you take it on an empty stomach, just because it kicks in a lot easier than when it's mixed with food. And if that beverage takes you, I don't know, all the way to noon to finish, then maybe just drink it at the beginning of the day. Because as I said, you want to take it in the morning so it doesn't disrupt your sleep pattern.
Cool, makes sense. I think that's everything. So Evan, if you're ready to go, have at it.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm just going to get my screen sharing going. All right, so I'm going to be kind of talking about what the unknowns are about microdosing, how that compares to macrodosing, if one or the other is something that you should do, how do you know that's right for you, things like that. So what we'll do is we'll start by comparing microdosing versus macrodosing. And we're going to touch on a few different parts of it, one being the frequency, so how often you do it, the benefits, so what you get from it, and the risks, what might go wrong. And just to go down through them, we have microdosing is more of like a supplementary thing, where I find where you're doing it either daily or weekly in dosing regimens to improve your day-to-day well-being. You're trying to focus on improving like your depression, your stress, your ability to focus on things, your imagination, things like that. And really, there aren't a whole lot of recorded negatives beyond having an improper dose, which would be a dose that's too high, as Anna mentioned. One thing in clinical studies that has shown up, though, is that there is an increase in neuroticism, which is you're more emotional. You have more emotional reactions, and that can be a good thing. You can have a really profound experience that's happy, but you can also have a profound experience that you feel really overwhelmed and really sad, or things like that. And I found that was one of the things that I did have to keep in mind with microdosing, is that the neuroticism, especially with someone with anxiety, it's easy to get overwhelmed. So if that's the case, it's good to manage and starting on the lower end of your microdosing, especially if you're out doing something. And so with that, we'll move over to macrodosing. And this is a bit more of, it's like a barrier to entry, I would say. Not a lot of people are as comfortable with macrodosing for obvious reasons. And but to start with, we'll just go over like the benefits and things like that. So you're comparatively not doing it very often compared to microdosing. Some people will do it once in their entire life and feel that's as many as they'll ever need. But not only for the fact that it's often more profound, it's also because of the tolerance and the novelty. So if you were to do a microdose and you waited a couple of days, you would be back to normal. But if you were to do a macrodose and you waited a couple of days, that because you're taking a larger amount of the substance, your brain isn't back to the baseline yet. The baseline for microdose or macrodosing rather is roughly considered to be about 2 weeks. So if you were to take the same size macrodose the next day, it would roughly take about 300% the dose to feel the same effects. And not only that, with tolerance, there's also a novelty to it. So if you're having some profound experience every week for 2 years, near the end of that 2 years, you're not going to be having the same experience going in. It's going to be not as intense. It's going to be not stand out to you as much. It might blend in with all the other trips. So a lot of people, they like to have very irregular large doses to kind of keep that magic to it. They don't want to have that lost. And some of the benefits would be seeking like profound spiritual or emotional breakthroughs. You have this beautiful ego death or things like that. Some people often use them for trauma work. So it's useful for helping people bring up trauma and deal with trauma that either they knew was there and they need to address, or they didn't even know was there and just kind of sidelines them. And a lot of that is kind of like the current focus, which is treatment for like PTSD and depression, where a lot of those disorders are stemmed in trauma. One of the other uses, of course, is recreation. Not a lot of people recreationally dose microdosing, but it's very common with macrodosing. And to ignore the fact that that's a thing, I think would be just like silly. Like, it's obviously something that a lot of people do, and it's something that a lot of people find beneficial. That being said, there are a lot more risks with macrodosing than microdosing, at least on the short term. It's much more involved. You're going to be impaired for several hours. It's not something you can do and go to work, but it's definitely not quite as risky as some people like in mainstream media might say. There are a lot of aspects you have to manage. So your setting, who you're doing things with, are all very important with macrodosing. Any bit of that could basically bring up backups. It could cause you to be uncomfortable in the situation and then make you want out, which you can't really get out of. You're in for 6 hours compared to microdosing, which is just like a small discomfort compared to a huge panic. One last thing I want to touch on with macrodosing benefits is HPPD. So it's not as common as some people might think, but it is a very rare condition in which people can experience these effects long term. So the effects from a macrodose might not be the same intensity, but you can still see like visual skewings, you can see blurs, or maybe an intense confusion feeling. And so although it affects a very small amount of people, it is something that we need to bring up and say that it's not going to happen, but it is very, very rare, and it's something that people are still studying. They don't really know why it happens or what might be what might make you like susceptible to it, I suppose. So now that we've went over the basics of each one, I think we will go over to some of the common reactions to be mindful of. And we had someone speak up on this in the comments asking questions. And the biggest thing that people should keep in mind are SSRIs and antidepressants and other prescription medications. With psychedelics in general, not just with microdosing, with SSRIs or other antidepressants, basically what these do is they act on the same serotonin receptors that psychedelics do. And because they inhibit the reuptake of serotonin, they basically keep the psychedelic from affecting you to its full extent. You basically can have anywhere from a light tolerance to a quite large tolerance, especially with macrodosing. Now, in terms of microdosing, I personally did not find that it really prevented me from getting results with microdosing, sorry. It affected the dose that I gave myself. I was much closer to about 100 milligrams on SSRIs. And now that I'm off of them, when I was, my regimen that I had done a couple months ago was, I think, much lower. It was near like 35 milligrams instead of 100. So you will have a bit of a tolerance effect, but I don't see it being any kind of dangerous effect. That being said, if you are looking into other psychedelics, say ayahuasca or anything like that, be very careful on which prescription drugs. If you're not sure how it might react, talk to your doctor. Don't use us as the reason for saying that you should or not. It's really, really key that you ask a professional if you're not sure. That being said, we can move on to some of the more common things that people might not realize affect microdosing. And my two big ones are cannabis and caffeine. So I tend to use both fairly frequently. And when I'm microdosing, I find they can definitely catch me off guard a lot more than normal. So if say I'm microdosing and I have coffee, it might pep me up a little more. I might feel that. I say, "Ooh, that's a strong coffee." But I get that extra, what's the word, neuroticism. So I get more anxious. I can feel the negative effects of the coffee as well. So I think it's like an amplifier of whatever you're doing. Caffeine especially can definitely, was my main thing, was the anxiety. With cannabis, however, it was different. It was more of a confusing feeling. Like Anna said, I felt more tired. I felt a little bit disgruntled, like I was a little bit discharged. I had trouble like following thought processes and things. So cannabis in general does that, but I do believe that when I'm on a microdose, I notice more of an effect of that than when I'm not. There are other things too as well, like alcohol, I'm sure would affect you, but I can't really speak much on alcohol because I don't really drink. That's definitely something that, like, if you're going to be doing a substance that may interact with it, it might be good to just say, how did I feel that day? And would it have been different if I wasn't microdosing? Yeah, so those are some of the reactions that we can kind of keep in mind. And the important note I want to make before I moved on was, I already touched on it a little bit, but if you are taking any kind of prescription, always make sure with your doctor or whoever that it's not going to react negatively. Just a couple examples would be SSRIs and MDMA. It's not particularly a microdosing drug, but it is something that would negatively interact and potentially cause fatal side effects. So always be careful, always make sure that there are no potential interactions. Anything with an MAOI, so ayahuasca and SSRIs are also a no-no, you can't mix those. So there are some documents online that I can link in the future, and you can kind of go through and see what interacts with what should be avoided and things like that. But also go to your doctor. So we're going to move on to long-term use and the fact that there aren't a whole lot of studies beyond anecdotal evidence on like how it affects you over like a year or 2 years or 3. And why haven't we heard anything about it if it's been around since the Silicon Valley days? So we have heard a lot about it, and there's all kinds of evidence through people's personal experiences, but because of the psychedelic renaissance only recently happening, like a lot of the studies are currently focused on breakthrough treatments for depression and PTSD, and a lot of those have to do with macrodosing. Like macrodosing is where you get the results right now, and you can say, hey, this works, and show the health authorities. So a lot of the focus has been on macrodosing right now and larger doses and some breakthrough treatments, but there are some studies that are ongoing, and people are working to fill in that gap of knowledge with microdosing. So for long-term use, there are some theorized risks that personally I don't find are substantiated. I don't think there's any real proof that says this absolutely is the case. And they agree as well. They say it's something that should be looked at, but it's not something that they really think is like an immediate concern. So The first one is kind of a controversial topic, and I'm curious to see what other people think in the group, but mental dependencies. So mental dependencies are often something that not a lot of people consider. Like, I can be mentally dependent to coffee, for an example, but it's not an addiction. It's not something that you feel like you need to have, or you're going to go through withdrawal or anything. It's more of the idea of feeling like you need to take something to have a good day. And I don't think microdosing should be treated that way. I don't think it should be treated as a happy pill or something, because it isn't. It's not. If you're feeling stressed, it's not going to make you feel better, at least in my experience, to an extent. Like, if you're in a stressed mood that day and you microdose, you probably are going to be stressed still, unless it's something major changes and you happen to have a good day. Like, but I also think it's good to keep in mind, say, taking breaks every couple months and saying, just checking in with yourself and living without it for a while and seeing how you do compared to it. And like, if you feel like, wow, I need to microdose, or I'm not going to have a good day, then maybe there's something underlying that. Maybe there's something we need to look at beyond that. Sleep and dietary changes. Now, Anna mentioned this about psychedelics, where they are very stimulating. Not in the traditional sense, but more in the sense that it's hard to shut your brain off. So if you microdose at 5 p.m., there's a chance that when you go to bed, your mind's going to be racing, you're going to be tossing and turning, you can't feel comfortable. So as long as you manage when you microdose, I personally don't think this is a long-term issue. Dietary changes, however, there is a little bit of study, and also Anna mentioned with too big of a dose, there is a little bit of study in weight gain increase, which I will speak on in my next slide. But that also maybe, as she mentioned, contributed to a dose that is too high. It's possible that you're getting these effects that you wouldn't get if you dose properly, and it's just something that is a hazard. It's something of a side effect rather than something that's like a guarantee. Cardiovascular health, this is also something that people have mentioned in previous talks. Basically, where this came from was a study about very, very chronic MDMA use, so like multiple times a week, causing a buildup of, I think it was like tissue in the heart, and causing issues with valves in which severe heart conditions arose. And a lot of this is disputed. While it may be the case that these things can affect you long-term as well with the other substances like mushrooms and psilocybin, it hasn't been proved. The only real theory on why it might is because they both act on the same 5-HT2B receptor. But overall, it's hard to say if that's something that's really a concern, and they definitely demand more research into it. But currently, especially, you can go for an example, Rick Doblin, I think, of MAPS in the United States. He speaks quite a bit on this study and why it's kind of misleading, especially even just with MDMA use in general. So that's where that came from. I just thought I'd touch on it because it is something that people have been talking about with cardiovascular health and microdosing. So coming to the mention of weight gain, we have an animal study that I found recently on microdosing NN-DMT with rats. So this is not ayahuasca. This is the chemical component in it that isn't the MAOI. It's basically just the pure DMT. And in rats, they basically showed all of the usual expected behavior increases that would be in some of the other studies that have been done. So they showed a significant decrease in behavior that's associated with like depression, anxiety responses. So basically in animals, that means if they're not moving around, if they stay very still, chances are they're more depressed, and things like interacting with like other members of their group also are generally affected. And they saw a positive net gain in those effects. But they also saw a significant body weight gain for male rats over the 2-month period, and a noticeable neuronal atrophy in female rats, which is the opposite of neurogenesis, which is mildly concerning, but also not substantiated because this is only one single study. And it's also in DMT, which isn't LSD or psilocybin, which is the most common psychedelic. The thing is with this is that it does show that the chemical interactions that you have between a very small dose and a very large dose might be different, even though something may give you neurogenesis in one side, it may actually negatively affect. So it's something that, while hasn't been proved in humans or anything like that, and there's only been like a single study on it, we don't fully know yet. We really need to not kind of pass psychedelics off as this wonder thing, when really we need to take some time and fully clinically study them before we can really say that. So I'd like to touch a bit on the placebo effect and how that affects microdosing in general. And to start with that, I'll say, well, what is the placebo effect and why does it matter? So the placebo effect is feeling something that basically you expect to happen, even though it's not actually the case. So like, and just to put it in a basic example, in a control test for psychedelics, say I would be given a control group and a test group, and the control group would be given something that was not psychedelic or psychoactive, and the other group would and have that psychedelic. So they basically, they can use that group that doesn't actually have any substance, and any effects they actually report would be considered a placebo. It's something that they perceive to be affecting them, even though there is no actual outside force acting it. And this can actually be quite powerful. In a couple studies, this is a somewhat mainstream one, I suppose. It's like they had a study of a supposed psychedelic substance, and they were monitoring the effects, and all of the other people were actors except one. And the person that wasn't the actor would continue to feel the effects of this supposed psychedelic, even after they were told that it was a controlled placebo and that they weren't actually under the effect of anything. So if your brain thinks you're acting and you're feeling something, or you're going to feel something, you are more inclined to actually feel that. So how does that actually compare to microdosing, and how have studies found the expectations of microdosing standing up to the actual results? And do those expectations actually affect the results? And from what they could find, no. The study that I'm going to quote, they basically had two different groups. And the first study, they showed just a basic test with microdosing. So they rated them over a number of different behavioral ratings, so like depression or absorption or mind wandering, and these things like that, that basically kind of touch in with you on how you are emotionally throughout the day or throughout the 2-month period. And the studies from them showed that they had a noticeable increase in some of the following. They had a noticeable increase in depression, or decrease in depression rather. So they had less stress, they were less depressed overall. They had less mind wandering, so they were able to keep focus on tasks at hand better. They didn't find themselves just like squirreling off. And absorption, so they had an increased amount of absorption as well. So it's not so much the ability to retain information, it's more being absorbed into something that is going on. So if there's something that's very engaging, imaginary, it's pulling you in, you're getting absorbed. That was also quite noticeably increased as well over pretty much all of the subjects. The only real negative thing that was seen or observed was the increase in neuroticism. So with the neuroticism, essentially that is just being more emotional, as I had mentioned before. You feel more, it's not necessarily you're gonna feel bad all day, but you might cry at a sad movie, and it might catch you off guard because maybe you wouldn't do that otherwise. It's just things that they kind of grab you a little more, I suppose, in layman's terms. And for the second study, what they did was they took that result and they added additional expectations to the group before they were sent through. So the second group of people were expected all of the other traditional things like, oh, it'll make you more creative, it'll make you, and so they basically went through and they found as many positive effects of microdosing as they could that didn't necessarily correlate with their actual findings, but they used those figures as basically expectations to set. So they might say, oh, you're going to have increase in math skills or something like that. And none of those things that they were told to expect actually affected the outcome. So these second group of people all had the same increases in depression, mind wandering, absorption, and neuroticism, but the ones that they tried to set up for expectations and the people going into it actually thought microdosing would affect them in that way, they didn't notice any difference. So that strongly points to the fact that placebo isn't particularly involved with microdosing effects, considering how consistent these effects were in a very large amount of the study population. Yeah, so with microdosing, I basically think that it's good to keep a journal, and it's good to try to keep an idea of like how it's affecting you, but it's also good to try to think about what you may be imparting on that experience and what actually you're feeling. So just kind of keep an eye on like, geez, well, do I think I'm feeling this because I was told this in microdosing? And it's easy for you personally to actually convince yourself of those things. The point of the study is that they want to empirically measure it. And personally, it brings to the question, as a microdoser, if you personally feel that it does increase your math skills, or it does do something that most people don't attribute to microdosing, or even the clinical studies do, does it matter if you get those results? And personally, I'm very empirically minded, so I like to see those studies and I like to see what the actual cause is. But placebo is something that can generally affect you for the good if you perceive it to be a good thing that's going to come to you. So a lot of that debate is, well, do we really need to know, do we really need to put that much focus on it? And I think we do, just to actually find the empirical things that microdosing gives you, but it's ultimately not that important for the layman. So I wouldn't tear your hair out trying to think, geez, well, am I feeling this really, or is this just my mind? Like, it's not something to be too worried about, I don't think, at least in the day-to-day. So for my conclusion, I just kind of wanted to touch on how I use psychedelics and how I view them. And to me, I personally find that microdosing and macrodosing have very different applications. Microdosing is more like a day-to-day supplement, where a macrodose is like a very large, momentous, like operation almost. Like it's this one single event that could give you this huge increase in whatever, and then the microdosing is more of like a daily building on that afterwards. And I personally use both. I tend to lean towards macrodosing because that's what I find I get the most results out of. I don't tend to feel like I need the day-to-day boost as much, though I do go through regimens. My most recent one was in December, I believe, for microdosing, where I was doing about 25 milligrams. And that definitely helped a lot. And it did help me with the day-to-day when I needed it. But I wouldn't stay on it all the time. I wouldn't do it my whole life. I kind of use it as a transitionary period where I'll go on a regimen for a while, and then I'll go off them, and then I'll go back to macrodosing. So I'll do a macrodose every month or two, and I just kind of go back and forth between those two states. So if I feel like large amounts of things need to be worked on, or big things that are huge broad stroke brushes, then I use macro. I use big doses. And with small little things in day-to-day and just increasing my general enjoyability of what I'm doing any personal day, like microdosing is a very useful tool. And some people will say that they prefer to replace their antidepressants and things like that with SSRI or with medicated or microdosing. I don't personally think that that is the case. I think it's all very, very personal. So you need to talk to your doctor and say what's working for you, what's not. You need to try to manage if you think the SSRIs are like doing things. And for my personal experience, I ended up coming off of SSRIs to use macrodosing full time as my depression treatment. But that's not the case for some. I don't personally say everyone should. And I really think that it would be harmful for people to say that no one should be doing it, antidepressants. And for people that personally find them to be what works for them, you can microdose as well, and even macrodose, and you can manage those things together in a complementary way. So I'd say that's pretty much the end of what I wanted to say. I hope it was relatively coherent, and thanks everyone for listening.
So the first question was from Rakesh. He had some concerns about the quality of substances, especially now that there are, some, online people selling microdoses. Just the one thing I will mention in here was this is not a time to talk about sourcing drugs as a disclaimer. And then the other disclaimer would be to make sure, there are testing facilities around town that can be used if you're uncertain about any of the substances. But Evan or Anna, did you want to add anything beyond that?
So I'd like to just mention with psilocybin, it's relatively, like, I would say not to buy capsules from a store. I personally think that it's probably a better idea to weigh them yourself, unless it's a very reputable source. And there are some around Vancouver. I'm sure if people need to find sources, they can through other means. But yeah, I don't think that you should rely on the capsules if you're not sure. I think if you weigh it yourself, if you grind it all yourself, you have this personal investment and you know what's going in, and there's less worry about that. Because if you go into a microdose worrying about that, it's going to affect that microdose quite a bit, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I have a similar experience where the ones that I bought initially were not really working with me really well, and I found that they used a different strain that
Yes.
I like, so I switched to a different. So they were using Mexican cubensis, and I started microdosing with Golden Teacher, and that suits me a lot better. So yeah, you just want to do it yourself.
Excellent, thank you. Another one, got one from a guest asking about if they need a trip sitter for microdosing.
I don't think so.
No. What I would say is, if you're doing microdosing and you're a little unsure, maybe don't do it on work the first day. Maybe take it the day that you're having a nice day in the park or something as your first experience with it. But other than that, I wouldn't say you need a trip sitter, as long as you weigh it out properly. If you accidentally take 5 grams, you'll definitely need a trip sitter. But with the microdose, you want.
Yes.
Awesome. So we're going to go to the first live question here from Jeremy. Jeremy, your mic should be unmuted if you want to have a go.
I can stop screen sharing as well. Just 1 second.
Yeah, that'll be good too. Thanks.
There we go.
Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, when should a person stop microdosing if they want to go ahead and do a macrodose?
So I don't know if Anna has much to say on that. Personally, I would go 2 to 3 weeks in general. Basically how the tolerance works is it's kind of like related to weight that is ingested. So if you're microdosing and you're waiting the proper 2 days anyways to come down, you're not taking microdosing every day, then you will probably already have less of a tolerance after a week than if you were to take like a full macrodose. But yeah, if you really want to be sure, I'd give it 2 or 3 weeks or so.
Yeah, that's what I did. I normally wait a few weeks in between micro and macro.
And then going back from macro to micro, you would then have like another transition period?
Yes, I
Yes.
normally go for like a month or so.
About the same here.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
It's also a personal feeling, right? I guess you know when you're ready. But
Yeah, true.
Nice. Cool. Thanks, Jeremy. Wanted to read out another one. This was from Kate. Have either of you ever tried anything in between the low subperceptible and kind of the macro large dose, so low but perceivable?
I've tried 900 milligrams, I guess, of penis envy, but no, it wasn't like microdose or in between. I just tried. I was just tripping on a very small dose of mushrooms. So, yeah.
I have done a little bit of messing around with about 0.5 grams of psilocybin, but a lot of the times I did it, I was currently on SSRIs, so the tolerance effects are quite different. I haven't done, the only time I did a 0.5, since I haven't had any SSRI tolerance, I found it kind of unpleasant, but I was also out in public at a park with geese honking around me, and that kind of made me nervous. So I don't think it was, I think it was more of the situation than the actual post microdose as in above microdosing.
Nice.
But yeah, if you're in a good situation, I'm sure.
Nice. Another dose-related question. This is from a guest, so I'm not sure who it is. Basically, some kind of summarize our question. If they first do it and feel nothing, should they increase the dose or and try more the next day? I guess I have heard some folks talking about kind of ramping it up until you feel something and then backing it down. So you're kind of getting the most you can get subperceptual. Do you have either of you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's basically, sorry, Evan.
No, I was, yeah.
Go ahead.
Nope, continue, sorry. So I was just basically going to say that, that I didn't really have much of a, sorry, continue.
The way I did it is I went very granular. So when I went back, I did probably in between 75 and 50, and that was still a bit too much. So I went back to 50, and then that seemed to be like the right dose. But I guess, yeah.
I definitely heard that technique.
Yeah. So the only thing I was going to say was don't redose the same day. Still take the 2 days. That was the only thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, no, good call. Awesome. And the last one, actually got one from Rakesh live here. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Rakesh, take it away. You are live.
Hey, well, I had a question, which is for a beginner. Is there any recommendation over one microdosing to another, like mushrooms or LSD? And at least with the SSRIs, I was told that if we need to get off the SSRI, we have to consult the doctor, and it's a gradual, phasing off from the SSRI. Is that the case with microdosing as well? If we want to be completely off microdosing, does it have to be a phased approach, or can it be a drastic?
Wait, so you're referring to tapering off of microdosing, you're saying? Is that correct? Yeah. I wouldn't say that you have to taper off of microdosing now. Basically, the reason you taper off of SSRIs is because they have a lot of really unpleasant side effects if you suddenly go from a lot to none. Microdosing doesn't have those side effects, so you don't have to do that. And what was the first part of your question again? Sorry.
Yeah, is there, for a beginner, is it recommended to go microdosing with, either LSD or psilocybin, or does it, it doesn't matter which one?
My personal thought would be to maybe start with mushrooms, because just the dosing is easier if you're not sure about like the LSD dosing, just because like you have to do the extra step of adding it into distilled water and things like that. But you also have to do those steps with mushrooms as well. You still have to homogenize them and things like that, which is grinding them into small amounts and putting them in capsules so that you're not getting one that's stronger than another. So you do have to do steps for both. I personally found psilocybin was more accessible and less stigma involved, but
in my experience, mushrooms versus LSD, and from what I've read on the internet, they do give you slightly different effects. So if you are going for mental focus and really getting your to-do list, or like going through your tasks quite fast and being in that flow mode, and you don't necessarily want to be too creative, then you can do LSD. But if you want to increase your creativity or being more social, then microdosing with mushrooms would definitely be a more preferred choice. And I do like microdosing with mushrooms more than with LSD, but that's just my personal preference. And I've heard different opinions, so I guess you'll have to try it for yourself and see exactly.
One comment I'll add real quick just is I am aware that there are some folks out there that do supply smaller doses of LSD that can address the kind of the watering down thing,
Yes.
dilution technique. So that does exist, but that's as far as I'll say.
Great.
So I think we got one. Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead, Evan.
We had the one guest asking about weight problem or weight gain.
Oh yeah, go ahead. That's what I was going to read next.
Yeah, so I personally don't. The place that I got that data was from a clinical study on rats. I don't have any anecdotal data from people about weight gain with microdosing so far. Although it is possible, say, if you are taking a dose that happens to make you more hungry, like Anna said, which would be a too high a dose, like maybe that was why. It's just things like that. Like there's a lot of variables in that test that I wouldn't put too much weight on that yet.